Hey everyone, so we are now officially through our discussion forums. I just wanted to say that I thought you all killed it in these discussion forums throughout the course of the semester. I really can see now that we're at the end the incredible growth that you've all really demonstrated in terms of your critical reading, critical writing, and most importantly, critical thinking skills. I'm super impressed with the quality of our forums, especially in the latter half of the semester. I think we really kind of pulled apart a lot of these texts and really honed our skills in terms of taking two seemingly disparate works from different cultures, different time periods, different social constructs, and really put them in conversation in interesting and nuanced ways. So, cheers to all of you for working hard throughout the course of this semester and for putting in such good work. So, now we're at the place where we're going to take that good work and we are going to sort of have this moment where you get to kind of perform for the final last time in your final papers. I like to think of your final essays as kind of like your recital or your championship game. You get to put to work all of these new skills that you've really developed and honed over the course of the semester. So I want to just go over a couple of things in regards to your final papers so you're all clear on what you should be doing and what's expected of you. Firstly, I really want you to go back over the document that's posted under resources. It's called Paper Guidelines, and it has all of the details that you need to know in terms of how to structure this type of an essay and also the formatting requirements for this type of an essay. Very briefly, you're going to be writing 5 to 7 pages. Okay, so a little bit longer than your midterm papers were. 5 to 7 double spaced pages, 12-point font, Times New Roman, 1-inch margins. You need an official sort of MLA style heading that should be in the upper left-hand corner of your paper, your name, the course title, my name, the date. In the upper right-hand corner, you want to make sure that you have page numbers, and you also want to make sure that you have a separate works cited page. When I say 5 to 7 pages, I mean 5 full pages of your own writing and then an additional works cited page. Also, really try to stay within those guidelines. Make sure that you don't go much over 7 pages, if at all. I mean, if it's an extra paragraph, okay. But part of this process is really learning how to edit yourself and streamline your ideas so that you can stay within the confines of the paper guidelines. So review that document before you really get going, and certainly before you submit your work, so that you're clear, you understand and can check and make sure that you have all of those sort of formatting guidelines in place. Okay, so your goal is to choose one of the prompts that I provided you with and to consider 2, no more than 3 texts that we've read throughout the course of the semester in order to answer one of those prompts. Here's the stipulation in terms of the texts that you can use. One of the texts that you examine must be from the latter half of the semester, so after the midterm paper on. You have to use one text that we've read in the latter half of the semester. The other text can be from throughout the entire semester. However, you can't write on something that you already covered in your midterm paper. So if you already covered a story in your midterm paper, you cannot recycle it in your final paper. You have to choose all new stories. Duh. Okay, so that's the one kind of stipulation in terms of the stories that you choose. What I also want you to do is I want you to go back to the announcements when I reviewed, I gave you some general feedback on your midterm papers in one of the announcements, and I attached for you a sample midterm paper. Use this as a model to kind of examine and draw from to make sure that you are on the right track in terms of structuring your paper, in terms of the quality of your thesis statement, in terms of the quality of your critical engagement with the text. Is it a perfect essay? No, that does not exist. There's no such thing as a perfect essay. Essays are always, in my opinion, a sort of work in progress. There's always room to grow. However, it is a good, substantial model to use in order to help guide, if not your writing process, certainly your editing process, to make sure that you are on the right track. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a couple of things specifically in this sample midterm paper, just to kind of talk through and show you, a little bit more specifically with a specific template, what I mean when I say an analytical thesis statement or direct comparative engagement between the text in your body paragraphs. I want you to be able to follow along, and then I'm just going to talk through. I'm not going to talk through the whole essay, but I will talk through a couple of points so that, again, what I'm asking of you is a little bit more crystallized. So firstly, in your introduction, and this is so basic, you want to make sure that you introduce both the stories that you're going to be using. And most short stories should be included not in italics, but in quotation marks. So how to designate properly a short story is quotes, in quotes, not italicized. Italicized, you use italics for a more formal title of a book, like an anthology, the name of a novel, a novella, something like that. So you want to include the actual short story titles. You also want to make sure that you include the full author's names in your introduction. I know this seems like so obvious, but it is not sometimes. And you want to make sure that you are spelling the author's names correctly and you're representing them accurately. At least one time in your introduction, usually in the first lines, you want to introduce the full author's names and their respective stories. After you include the full author's names one time, then you can refer to the authors simply by their last names throughout the course of the rest of your essay. So make sure that you're not referring to, these authors by their first names, because you're not like bros with these authors, but as a sign of respect, just their last names after you introduce them fully one time in your introduction. So full authors' names, the actual titles of the stories, and then of course you want to provide whatever pertinent social, historical, political, cultural details that you think are important in terms of situating your analysis, the analysis that you are going to do. Again, like we have to say, these texts are not written in bubbles, that they come from specific places and that there are influences on the authors. And so we need to take stock of them so that we can really do our due diligence in analyzing these texts. So I'm going to read through just part of the introduction so that you get a sense of what I'm talking about from the sample midterm paper. So Kate Chopin and Angela Carter, great. We've got both authors' names right out of the gate. Cool. Kate Chopin and Angela Carter, two feminists of their times, expressed the power of the women in their respective works. Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, short story title, features Mrs. Mallard, a housewife who has just heard of her husband's apparent death. Angela Carter's The Earl King features a young girl who becomes enthralled by the mysterious Earl King. I'm going to pause for a second. I also like that this particular student gives a really brief synopsis of what these two stories are about. We don't go on for pages. This isn't a summary of the two stories, which is not what you want to do, but a brief line of basically here's the plot point of this story and here's the plot point of this story. That's important, okay, to include, and it's perfectly acceptable to include it in your introductory paragraph. Okay, upon first glance, these two characters could not be more different. Mrs. Mallard is representative of most suppressed housewives in the early 19th century, and the Earl King's protagonist, as a Red Riding Hood-esque character, is a timeless fairy tale, though written in the late 20th century. Pause. So another good thing is that we get the sort of time periods that both of these texts were written in so that, when this particular student is introducing the idea of them both being sort of feminist texts or coming out of some kind of feminist traditions, we can understand the time periods that they were both written in, because the values and the social norms of those times will be different. And that's important to note. Okay. Though separated by time and genre, the two protagonists have more in common than meets the eye. Both Mrs. Mallard and the Erlking's protagonist are restrained in their relationships and are strong feminists who break free of these suppressive associations. So here's another good thing that the student is doing. The student is actually making a connection, drawing these two texts together in a very specific way. So again, right out of the gate in your introductory paragraph, I'm seeing how the student is actually trying to bring these two texts into conversation with one another, not just generally, like they could be compared and contrasted, but really specifically. And that's clear right from the outset, which I appreciate. The rest of the introductory paragraph is just the thesis statement. And again, you want to make sure that your thesis statement is analytically based and not observationally based. An observation would be these two texts can be compared and contrasted. Right, I already know that, right? I'm telling you that they can be compared and contrasted. What I'm actually asking you to do, what I'm interested in, is how, in what ways can they be compared and contrasted? To what ends can they be compared and contrasted? For what purpose? What new insights can we gain from putting these two texts in conversation with one another with a particular angle? So that is essentially the goal and how you should be thinking through constructing your thesis statement. So this particular student's thesis statement is, these two women find power in claiming freedom from the men that suppress them, designating them feminist characters of their times, with Mrs. Mallard taking a passive role and the Erlking's protagonist an active role. So that's interesting. So, I mean, I actually think that this thesis could be tweaked to be a little bit more clear, but I like that there's something at stake here. So both of them are connected in a particular way, that they are sort of feminists of their times, and that they find power in claiming freedom from their respective male counterparts. But there's a difference between them in that Mrs. Mallard's role is a little bit more passive. Her journey towards finding her freedom is a little bit more passive, while the protagonist in the Erlking takes a more active role. And maybe the way to tweak that even further is to say, and perhaps that indicates the social commentary of the fact that Mrs. Mallard is living in the 19th century, where there were probably still more restrictions on female characters and what female characters or what women in general could do in terms of asserting power at that time, and what a modern 20th century, late 20th century female character can do. Say hello to Olive in the background. Right? So maybe that's one way in which we can kind of like just tweak this thesis that one extra step to tie in the two sort of environments and social, cultural, political influences bearing down on these two authors. So this is just one example of how to put together a sort of effective introductory paragraph. Full authors' names, titles of the stories, connect them in some particular way, situate them in terms of their social, political, historical context, and bring them into conversation with one another in a sort of original way with something at stake, right? Not just, we could look at them because they could be compared and contrasted, but like how and for what purpose? Okay. Your body paragraphs, I'd like to see all of your body paragraphs have both stories, or if you're doing 3 stories, all 3 stories within the same body paragraphs. How are you going to do that? You're going to come up with some sort of topic sentence, some sort of main argument that you want to make in that particular body paragraph, and then you're going to showcase the ways in which the stories actually relate to that particular argument, okay? So instead of writing, because this happened quite a bit in your midterm papers, instead of writing about one story in one body paragraph, another story in another body paragraph, and maybe there's some, sort of light, direct comparisons between the two of them or connective thinking between the two of them. The majority of your thinking through was as if these two texts were sort of independent of one another. What I really want to see is you thinking through how these texts are actually communicating with one another. Not necessarily just how they are similar to one another, but also how they importantly diverge from one another and why that is significant, right? So the first body paragraph in this particular essay tries to connect the two and also showcases how they are different from one another in some ways. So before discussing the way the two characters attain their freedom, it would be crucial to discuss the similarities in their captivity and how their acknowledgement of their captive states differ. Both Mrs. Mallard and the protagonist of The Earl King are kept in metaphorical cages while engaged in their relationships. I like this because, again, right out of the gate, I know what the topic of this particular body paragraph is going to be about, and there's immediately a way in which they are being spoken about together and how they connect to one another. The protagonist, however, seems to be aware of the cage that the Earl King is weaving for her as it is being done, and Mrs. Mallard does not seem to acknowledge the captivity of her marriage until she is released from it. So here's a way they connect, and here's a way that they importantly diverge in terms of their captivity, right? Chopin writes, there would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. And now we have a quote. This is another important aspect of building a body paragraph, right? We have to draw specifically from the stories and provide textual evidence to support our arguments. The goal is not to just include a quote and call it a day. The goal is to actually find a quote that really speaks to this particular aspect of the argument you're trying to make that really helps to persuade your reader to see things from your perspective. It really shows the reader the support that you have in presenting your ideas. So that's the goal. And then you don't want to just drop in a quote and move on. You actually have to do the work for the reader in connecting that quote to your argument. So this is what the student does. Gives the quote. In her marriage, Mrs. Mallard's power overwhelmed her own, leaving him to live a free life while she remained confined as a housewife. While other women in 1894 may be content in their marriages and being housewives and mothers, Mrs. Mallard recognizes that she has potential outside of her marriage, and her husband can no longer impose his will upon her. Okay, so here's a quote. Here's an explanation of this quote. Here's this student tying in the particular time period and what was the sort of social norm, and tying it back to her argument. So these are important steps that you should be considering when composing your body paragraph. Then the student goes on to connect to the other text, to the Earl King. Similarly, the girl in the Earl King recognizes that she has potential outside of a confined relationship. In this case, however, she recognizes this confinement during the abuse itself and finds the ability to free herself of the cage of her relationship with the Earl King. Carter writes, I have seen the cage you are weaving for me. It is a very pretty one, and I shall sit hereafter in my cage among the other singing birds, but I shall be dumb from spite. So here's a quote to support this particular element of the student's argument. While other birds, which represent fellow girls who are being captivated by the Earl King, may be happily singing in their containment, the protagonist recognizes that she has the ability to live in freedom outside of the Earl King's clutches. The excerpt, the cage you are weaving for me, implies that she is not yet fully imprisoned by the Earl King and still has the ability to find freedom. The cage is still being woven and is not yet complete. So I also like that this student is really doing some close reading of the text, right? Really honing in on the actual language of these quotes and unpacking it a little bit in order to continue to further develop the student's argument. Okay, so this is, again, just an example of a body paragraph that is working to actively put these two stories in communication with one another, utilize textual support from both stories. It's important too that you are actually providing equal amounts of support so that your analysis isn't unbalanced in any way. Putting them into conversation, using textual support to showcase the student's ideas and argument, and really, really developing how they connect and where they diverge from one another in relation to the overall thesis statement. And the student ends the paragraph by saying, while both characters experience repression by their male partners, only the protagonist portrayed only the protagonist in the Earl King portrayed the awareness of limitations set by the man. So again, it's an analysis of these two texts, and then the end of the body paragraph kind of ties back to the general thesis statement that the student was trying to make. Okay, so that's like sample introduction. Here's one sample body paragraph. I'm not going to go through all of the others because you can read this essay yourselves. And then you have, of course, your conclusion. It should be its own paragraph, and it should echo your intro. It's the easiest way to remember the purpose of a conclusion. You echo your intro. What do I mean by that? I mean, you echo the ideas that you set forth in your introduction. So you want to echo the argument that you are making, and you want to echo just sort of the stories, the authors, and just your prevailing argument at stake in this particular essay. You want to basically remind the reader why you wrote this essay. It should come back full circle. Okay, so I mean, this is sort of what I'm hoping you will all produce in these final essays. Give yourself some time to work on, a detailed outline, depending on how you write. Some people need a detailed outline. Some people need to work in drafts. You will have, a little bit of time to work through your ideas. Our thesis forum workshop is currently open. You can post your introductory paragraphs. You can post just your thesis statements. I will provide you with feedback, and your fellow peers will provide you with feedback. Under the description of the thesis workshop are questions that you can draw from, use as guides when thinking through how to evaluate a fellow peer's thesis statement, so that you can be as sort of honest and generous and constructive as you possibly can be. I am going to be out of pocket on Saturday into Sunday. I'm actually having surgery on Saturday. No fun. But I will be, checking the thesis workshop forum frequently today, tomorrow, and then I'll be kind of back available on Sunday afternoon. Final essays are due on Monday by 5 p.m. You're going to upload them, preferably as Word attachments under the assignments tab. If you have questions in the meantime, try to get to me as quickly as possible so that I can just make sure that I'm getting back to you in a timely fashion. I know this is like stress central right now, so I want to make sure that, you have access to me. So be in touch with any questions, and good luck. Happy writing, happy editing. Bye.